When training for the Trampoline National League, I used to repeat the same skills over and over and over again. The coach is telling me to move my arm like this, or move my leg like that, or point my toes and straighten this part of my body. Because trampoline is judged, I needed to get my body in just the right position. And in school it was very similar, learning the same sorts of things, repeating over and over and over again, maybe lots of example questions, doing the same process, because I needed to learn the fundamentals, the best technique to get the right answer. But during my undergraduate degree in sports coaching, it became clear to me that this idea about fundamentals and the best technique wasn't entirely accurate. Spaced repetition, retrieval practice, rote repetition all rely on a faulty assumption: repetition. Not repetition without repetition. Variability not being a good or a bad thing, but variability as inevitable, unavoidable. Professional coaches add variability in lots of different ways, some rather wacky ways. Take Thomas Tuchel, a professional football manager. He made professional football players, soccer players, hold tennis balls during practice. Jason Orcott, a baseball hitting director, using hula hoops during practice. And then Novak Djokovic, a professional tennis player, arguably one of the best in the world, during practice had to hit the ball into the ground before the net. That's not repeating practice of a best technique. That's not repetition of the same sorts of things, at least not that they would be doing in their professional games. These are examples of differential learning, or the constraints-led approach to coaching, and repetition without repetition. These ideas are built from ecological psychology. And for this video, I've spoken with someone called Rob Gray, who wrote a book, How We Learn to Move, and that is what I'm going to build this video from, so you can follow this video as you read through the book if you want to. You can find a link to the book in the description below. But some people argue there is a best technique, a best way to do something, a position of the body, movement angles, or a certain movement solution. That best technique is what the educators know and need to tell the learners. An incredibly successful basketball coach, John Wooden, once proclaimed 8 laws of learning: explanation, demonstration, imitation, repetition, 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 and repetition. Tony Robbins, a world-renowned life coach, saying repetition is the mother of all skills. Daniel Coyle, in the best-selling book The Talent Code, said, "There is no substitute for attentive repetition." But, as Rob says in his book, there is a revolution against the idea of repetition. Its followers not only believe that repetition of the correct technique is not the key to skilled performance and learning to move, they believe that repetition of movement is not even possible. Now, Rob's book does focus on physical movements, which is what this video is going to focus on. But related ideas have been applied to other areas such as maths problems, science, English, literature. There's loads of other areas. But for this repetition without repetition, we actually need to go back to Nikolai Bernstein in the early 1900s. He watched blacksmiths swinging a hammer. His hypothesis was that the expert blacksmiths would be able to repeat the same movement over and over and over again because they were so good. When looking at the novices, they weren't able to repeat the same movement over and over, so a hypothesis confirmed, right? Well, the experienced blacksmith hit the same spot on the chisel, but not by repeating the same movement every time. As you can see by these early images of motion tracking, cyclography, lights, the expert movements were different. Jump forwards 100 years and you find similar results with professional potters. As you can see in this image, the hand movement patterns were different. The squares are different shades, which represents the movement patterns. There were cultural similarities between the potters, but the movements were still different. One study looked at a golf swing and compared experts and amateurs. If you average all the professional golfers' positions, you get degree angles. Elbow 130 degrees, shoulders at 66 degrees away from the body, and trunk rotation 60 degrees. But none of the professional golfers matched that best technique. So the average of these golf swinging movers is useless. Each player had variation. The late Ander Ericsson's famed idea of deliberate practice is often associated with repetition. This type of group comparison the expert performance approach and felt it was the critical first step in understanding the nature of expertise. looking at all the professional golfers' profiles and finding an average for the best technique. But like the golfers' profiles, professional swimmer profiles are different. All of the profiles are different, with different coordination styles and different movement patterns. We can identify different elite athletes in the same sport because of the variation in their movements. So it's not a best technique, and this suggests that variability, not repeatability or repetition, rules the day in skilled performance. Variation is everywhere. Heart rate variability, or HRV, is actually a good thing. Our heartbeat isn't an exact metronome. There is variation between 30 and 100 milliseconds. Elite athletes often have a higher HRV, and a lower HRV could indicate some cardiovascular issues. Or someone could just be in a high-pressured environment because that lowers the variability of the heart rate. But when we think about our eyes, they don't stay still when we are fixated on something. They move. Saccades. Objects can disappear from our consciousness if they remain still. This is known as perceptual fading, similar to when you're wearing a watch, but you're not consciously aware of it unless something changes. There's variation. The change or variation is what we detect, what we perceive. Traditional views of this variation is an extension from information theory. There is background noise blurring out the signal. So we need to remove the background noise to understand the signal. A football study tested this idea from a traditional view. 22 international football players had to make ankle movements blindfolded. One condition was barefoot, one had socks and boots, and one had insoles that had bumps on. As you might be able to guess, the ankle accuracy decreased when it went from the barefoot to the socks and boots. The socks and boots or clothes was blurring the signal, the movement accuracy. So then when adding bumpy insoles, you would think that it's going to get worse because that's adding more noise. But adding the bumps to the insole significantly improved performance such that it was slightly better than the level achieved when standing barefoot. I just want to emphasize that more noise, adding bumps, showed an increase in movement accuracy. So more noise helped. The added variability helped. Looking at this figure, we can see that adding noise, specifically random or stochastic noise, helps us see the lines. Rob quotes Rafael Nadal, another world-class tennis player, and said, "Every shot is different, every single one," suggesting variation is inevitable, and that's what professional players are saying. And Rob sums this up quite nicely. "If I want to produce the same outcome under ever-changing conditions, I have to use a different movement every time. Instead of a best technique, ideal solution, or gold standard movement patterns, we should be developing adaptable movements. Multiple solutions for the varied problems we may face. Having multiple solutions creates an advantageous state of redundancy, not reliant on one solution. So practicing with noise, practicing with variability." And this actually relates to injury in sports as well. You may have heard people say someone got injured because they did it wrong or they performed it too many times. The solutions being move the right way or just train less. But what if, again, it is about the variability in practice? Overuse injuries related to a lack of variability of practice. Practicing the ideal movement as an indicator for overuse injuries. For runners with knee pain, runner's knee, a study added variability to their gait, how they run. All participants had clinically meaningful improvements in pain. So when they added variability to the gait, it reduced the pain. When we look at the body, variability is everywhere. Take my arm, for example. There are 7 degrees of freedom. You've got 3 at the shoulder, then you've got 1 at the elbow, 1 at the forearm, and then 2 at the wrist. So that's 7 degrees of freedom. But then there are muscles contracting all the way through my arm, which adds loads of variation. Controlling all of this variation and all these degrees of freedom must be very, very difficult and require a lot of energy. Traditional approaches use mental models or a central executive CEO to control all of these degrees of freedom. That's how we explain how we learn to move. This supercomputer tells our body what to do. Some people think the supercomputer CEO central executive does all of it. Other people think there is delegation, kind of like in a business, the CEO gives the commands for the body to do all of the work. The term used for this command or these commands is motor programs, so the central executive CEO sends motor programs down to our body to move. And this therefore suggests that breaking movements down into fundamentals helps the degrees of freedom problem, separating the skills into fundamental movements or techniques. So training these fundamental general abilities will transfer into a person's skill. Doing vision practice, maybe reaction time practice, will help someone's performance in sport with their improved reaction time. Doing strength practice would improve someone's sport performance. Or doing hand-eye coordination practice would help with catching. The idea that acquiring a skill acquisition, is the boss CEO central executive getting the list of instructions for the commands to send the body. Once they have all of the individual instructions, all of the different parts, you can just execute the movement skill. But does this mean that there is a motor program or set of instructions for every possible movement and degrees of freedom? There is no real evidence that pulling apart abilities like perception and decision-making, training them out of context, and then putting them back together will actually transfer to improve performance in the overall skill you are trying to improve in the first place. If we look at a 2019 volleyball study, they got participants to follow a sphere. The idea was the sphere would represent the ball, so it would improve their volleyball skills. But as you might be able to guess, our results have shown that vision training in non-sport specific context improved cognitive performance, but seems to be less effective for improving sport specific skills. And then they go on to say, these evidences suggest that environment in which exercises were performed plays a key role to improve perception and action in sport specific skills, supporting the ecological approach to sport learning. Not breaking down or separating the skill into its small parts, but keeping it together as a whole. The FTC has actually intervened in some cases where people have claimed that vision training is much better than the evidence actually supports. They've given large fines to companies, and for those of you that are familiar, maybe in the past, with the brain training, it's very similar. The evidence for brain training is actually so unconvincing, the FTC actually stepped in and charged Lumosity $2 million for deceptive advertising. But if we don't organise movement through this central executive CEO sending commands down to the body, how do we do it? Self-organisation. Other organisation like a band conductor is possible, but the majority of biological systems are self-organised. A self-organised system is one in which small, minimally intelligent pieces follow local, simple rules by constantly interacting with each other. And sometimes very complex patterns can emerge. Behaviour. This research on bird flocks is one example. When testing Dunlin birds in a lab, their reaction time to a shock movement was 40 milliseconds. However, when they were acting in a flock, their reaction time was 15 milliseconds. Their supercomputer CEO central executive was acting faster when they were in a flock than when there was a shock movement. Now we could argue that the birds were anticipating the movements in the flock, which is why the reaction time was lower. But an alternative explanation is that the Dunlin birds were self-organised within the flock. They were moving with the rest of the birds, coordinating as a dynamic system. Instead of the central executive CEO boss, the movements were organised by surrounding local simple rules. That happening through the coupling of perception and action, constantly interacting with each other. I have shared various other examples of self-organisation, which is in the video that I linked up there, but the idea is that the organisation is self-organised by the birds, not mental models or mental representation processing. There's no central executive or mental representation needed for this organisation of movement. However, if this is true, and those that take an ecological approach believe that it is true, then training for self-organisation doesn't necessarily come from instructions or by following a plan. We don't need to come up with executive level plans for every possible situation we might face. By constraining environments, adaptable movement solutions can develop through self-organisation. And these self-organized movements are also more robust to errors. If there is a change or perturbation, the movement solution can be adapted. One study tested this when sounding out words. They tugged on a participant's jaw when they were saying words like bab. On the second B of bab, they tugged the jaw and the lips compensated to sound the word bab. The synergy of components work together to achieve the goal, not follow an anatomical movement pattern. When tugging on the Z of Baz, the tongue compensated, again trying to achieve the goal of the movement pattern rather than following this command coming down from the central executive. Training an ideal solution or a best technique for the supercomputer to send commands and instructions down to the body just doesn't seem to explain the data that we have about how we learn to move. Now, I mentioned constraining environments. When I say constraint, I'm sure lots of people can think of some. If you watch children's football, they are running all over the place, so you may want to add a positional constraint. You're only allowed to stay in this half of the pitch, you're only allowed to stay in that box, you're adding a constraint, a positional constraint to where they can run. Another popular constraint I saw in football when I was playing and when I was coaching and other coaches doing it is the 2-touch rule. You only have 2 touches on the ball, 1 for control, 1 for pass. All coaching, all education uses constraints. When we think of the Brazilian pickup games, and some refer to it as the nude game, yes, I'm still talking about football here, there are often far fewer constraints. Maybe no grass, no lines, no goals, no coaches. In England, I know this as jumpers for goalposts. You get your school jumpers and you put them down, and it doesn't really matter if the goals are in line or if who knows where the pitch is going to be, but there's your goals and then a ball and play. When I was out in Uganda when I was younger, teaching in schools, they used the same thing. They put t-shirts on the floor and they play. I mean, they played with no shoes on. I tried it, and kicking the football without any shoes on hurts, and stubbing your toe on roots hurts even more. But in those sorts of games, the players work out the teams. If it's unfair, they change them. We could describe this as unstructured or less constrained practice. However, most football coaching in academies in England, Germany, Spain are highly constrained practices. This does touch on the topic of early specialization versus diversification, but that's a topic of conversation for another video. So constraints are often used to develop skills across varying contexts. And Newell in 1986 actually suggested skills emerge by using constraints, not necessarily skills prescribed by the central executive. A constraint is something that eliminates certain possibilities or options for action. In ecological psychology, you may use the word affordance there, opportunities or invitations for behavior. But this means that using constraints reduces the degrees of freedom. Newell suggested 3 types of constraints. Individual constraints like height, width and size, etc. Environmental constraints, which we don't really have any control over, but we can still use them to our advantage. And then the most common type of constraint, the task constraint, the rules that coaches normally apply. If we look at a beginner for the first time, they will likely freeze things. They freeze their arms, they freeze their legs, they sort of act like robots when they're moving. I know I said in the past when I was coaching, you need to loosen up. But by loosening up, they're loosening up their degrees of freedom, which just ends in a mess oftentimes because they're making lots of mistakes. There are more possibilities or opportunities for behavior when they loosen up, so freezing actually helped performance. Coordinating movement therefore requires expertise or learning. So reflecting back on my old practice, instead of saying loosen up, I should have helped them learn how to. I could have adjusted the environment they were in so they could explore different movement solutions, but with not so much variability that they can't figure out how to change or what to do next. Essentially, finding a desirable difficulty, helping them not just act like robots. And going a little further, this golfer study actually suggested that amplifying errors helps. Amplifying errors or the wrong way to do things being more effective than showing someone or giving someone a solution, the best technique. Some golfers when swinging were told to move their body forwards the right way, some were told to move their body weight backwards the wrong way, and then there was a control group. The direct instruction of the right way and the control group didn't show much improvement, but direct instruction of the wrong way did. Results showed that MAE, amplification of error, is an effective strategy for correcting the technical errors, leading to a rapid improvement in performance. and that study was with direct instruction. So what if we create learning environments with constraints rather than giving them the answer? Adding a constraint that exaggerates or amplifies a problem in a movement solution rather than trying to give the athlete solution to correct, it seems to be more effective. So it seems we should let learners explore constrained environments for them to self-organize solutions to varied problems. But constraints can also expose opportunities as well as taking them away. Lowering basketball hoops maybe for a different type of practice. Restricting vision or hearing, encouraging other solutions, maybe educating attention and educating intention about different ways to behave. But as we grow, our individual constraints will change as well. In strength and conditioning, that's kind of the point, making players faster, stronger, more mobile. But these changing constraints change how we perform. Think about adolescent awkwardness, like massive growth spurts and then they're just discoordinated. Getting taller changes your points of observation, changes your action capabilities, changes coordination. Getting bigger, stronger, older, fatter, fitter changes the way that we move. It changes the individual constraints that we have. Therefore, moving skillfully involves coming up with new solutions to new problems, not just repeating the same old solutions. Adding variability to practice encourages individuals to find multiple solutions. That added variability can be manipulated by using constraints, the constraints-led approach to coaching. But the goal of adding these constraints is to encourage individuals to self-organize to find multiple solutions to a problem. The goal isn't to constrain to the point at which there is only one possible solution, the best technique. Now, when considering these opportunities for behavior, we can't really talk about this without discussing perception. Traditional approaches to perception break things down into properties like distance, size, slant, etc. These properties then get put together with cues, rules, and most likelihoods to calculate a mental representation. This mental representation is our experience of the world. The central executive then uses these mental representations to predict what we should do. This is often called indirect perception, something I went into more detail in the previous video, and in ecological psychology, this ecological approach, we don't use indirect perception, we use something different, direct perception. So not perceiving objective properties like distance, but relative properties. Properties within the organism-environment relationship, me plus environment. We perceive things differently relative to our expertise. If we struggle because of lower expertise, we may perceive things as faster or smaller, but as we develop our expertise, we may perceive things differently as bigger and slower. As we gain expertise, we could say we become calibrated. One study looking into this looked at how people perceived stairs. Some people were given a drink of water at the top after climbing the stairs, others an energy drink. Individuals that chose items with a greater energy density or more rapidly available energy estimated the staircase as steeper than those opting for items that provided less energetic resources. The organism-environment relationship altered how people perceived the task of climbing the stairs. People perceived the staircase as harder to climb relative to the drink at the end of the staircase. This does get me thinking about those that consume lots of caffeine. I personally don't consume caffeine, so I do have a biased view, but certainly something to think about. But this suggests that instead of a central executive giving an if-then XY prediction, we perceive directly in the organism-environment relationship. James Gibson, someone that spoke about direct perception a lot, and someone you'll probably become familiar with in the ecological approach, suggested this term called affordances. Perceived opportunities or invitations for behavior. For a performer, gaps do not look wide, opponents don't look near, and pitches don't look fast. Instead, performers see pass-through ability in a gap, tackle ability of an opponent, and hitability of a pitch. Our action capabilities and perceived action capabilities of others relate to perceived affordances, points of observation and action capabilities unique to each person. Organism. So relative properties instead of objective properties. And these relative properties work in systems. When we are coordinating, we could describe this as dynamic systems. Me and my mum walking through the door to the shops together, we perceive affordances for the system. We twist together to both get through the door, not the objective width, the additive width of both of our shoulders, but the perceiving the system as a whole. Directly perceiving whether, when and how to behave, i.e. twist to get through the door. When people get pregnant, obviously their bodies change. Their action capabilities change, individual constraints, and so it alters the affordances perceived. A study looking at this said, findings indicate that experience facilitates perceptual motor recalibration for certain types of actions. And this has been seen in lots of other contexts. The affordances perceived changes relative to the organism-environment relationship. But if it is all so different, how do we build habits? How do we build stable behaviors? How do we explain expertise, those finding multiple movement solutions? Well, if we think about drumsticks, they could be in sync or out of sync, in phase or anti-phase. One study looked at the relationship between those sticks, the degrees 0 to 180. But people struggled consistently hitting sticks at certain angles. They got pulled towards 0 and 180. But if we look at this figure, some were attracted to a third angle, 90 degrees. There were less timing errors at 0, 90, and 180 degrees. We could call these tendencies intrinsic dynamics. But these attractors, the 0, the 90, and the 180, the attractors don't just happen in drumsticks, it happens in other situations as well. This figure shows attractor states for walking. These attractors encouraging behavior to stabilize. Perturbations or interruptions can quickly go back to the stable behavior, the attractor, 0, 90, 180. I use this idea about attractors to help explain why it can be difficult to change habits, change stable behaviors, because they are attractors, they are attractable states. As we are attracted to stable behaviors, there needs to be a lot of disruption to move us away. If you think of a sheet, that's described as an attractor landscape, and when there's an attractor, there's a dip in the sheet. To be able to get out of the dip, there needs to be a lot of disruption and movement to move you out and potentially into another dip and another attractor state in that attractor landscape sheet. And as mentioned, there isn't necessarily one attractor in an attractor landscape. There could be multiple. So multiple attractors, i.e. 0, 90, 180 in a landscape. And this is where learning could be explained through exploring a perceptual motor landscape, attractor landscape, sheet. As players develop skills, they develop stable behaviors, attractors. But if the environment changes, the attractor, the stable behavior, may not be as effective. Rob in the book uses an example from NFL ball throwing mechanics. Tim used his developed behavior from college football and tried to use that in NFL. But in the NFL, they are faster than in college at getting to the person throwing the ball. So the developed movement solution, the stable behavior, the attractor, was less effective because it took longer, which wasn't as effective when you've got less time, such as in the NFL. Thinking about constraints, we would say the constraints of the task changed because the time has been reduced to be able to succeed and actually throw the ball. But this is also important because it suggests that we're not starting from nothing. We're not starting from a blank slate tabula rasa. We are starting with previous movement solutions. The blank slate tabula rasa assumption often comes from cognitive psychology and traditional approaches of explaining movement and experience and knowledge, but if we don't start with nothing and we're starting from somewhere, then we don't need a loan of intelligence, like a programmer telling a computer what to do, unless you believe we're living in the Matrix, of course. So yes, all knowledge is gained from experience, empiricism, but that starts before birth and changes in the organism-environment relationship. We are dynamically evolving our skills through the ever-changing attractor landscape. As learners, we want to be as efficient as possible, so we are attracted to stable behaviors. Human beings are brutally efficient learners. We are always learning, always looking for solutions through attractor landscapes. While a learning curve looks nice and simple and can be used in explanations, it doesn't represent our learning experiences. Learning is dynamic, non-linear, and unpredictable. Rob in the book actually suggests that education and educating individuals is more complex than rocket science. Programmed machines often lead to predictable results. predicting human behavior is far more complex. You might get close, but knowing whether, when, and how is almost, if not impossible, to predict in human behavior, especially when you consider the amount of variability or repetition without repetition that occurs in movements. So, an effective coach should attempt to design practice environments that foster exploration and promote self-organization rather than prescribing a solution to an athlete. This is where teaching games for understanding and the constraints-led approach to coaching can look very similar. TGFU, Teaching Games for Understanding, is a learner-centered approach in which teachers are encouraged to design modified games to develop the learner's understanding of tactical concepts. In contrast, the CLA, Constraints-Led Approach, adopts a learner environment scale of analysis in which practitioners are encouraged to identify and modify interacting constraints to facilitate the coupling of each learner's perceptual and action systems during learning. This will be a topic of a future video, but as Rob focuses on the CLA, the Constraints-Led Approach, that's what we're going to focus on now. When looking at throwing mechanics, one study looked at forearm flyout. The forearm flyout injury is related to baseball pitching when the forearm is separating from the body too early. Most people, as Rob said, and as I think most people would want to say anyway, is to give instructions. Well, don't move your forearm out too early. Maybe some coaches even giving a scare factor to the instruction. If you do this, you will get injured or it will hurt. Now that's not necessarily wrong. Explicit instruction isn't wrong. There's no wrong or right. It's just what's more effective. And if we do self-organize movements, then maybe using constraints could be more useful or effective when self-organizing. A tennis study from 2015 actually looked at instructions. Instructions like increase your maximum knee flexion by 5% or move the point of racquetball contact forwards 10 centimeters. Although players changed how they moved, there were large errors instead of 10 centimeters, 15 centimeters, or 5 centimeters. So these explicit instructions actually led to more errors. And then when there were changes, there was nothing more significant than just trial and error or natural variability. Remember, repetition without repetition, variability is inevitable. So the participants of this tennis study struggled to implement the explicit instructions. But something else about following these instructions is that they don't often stick. In the next session or the next week, they would likely go back to doing what they were doing before, the stable behavior, the attractor. I remember at university there were theories and conversations about controller kids, where you've got the controllers, the children being the characters on the screen, and if the coach lets go of the controller, the character just stops. It's like, I don't know what to do now. The idea being that the explicit instructions, the player without the explicit instructions, the controller movements, just got lost, wasn't sure what to do, didn't know how to problem solve themselves in these dynamic situations they found themselves in during the sport. Of course, this is an extreme example because we do self-organize, whether we know it or we don't, we self-organize. That's the ecological approach at least. But anecdotally, I've seen in various sports, football, handball, basketball, and trampoline, my main sport, that when a coach stops giving instructions, the performer looks lost, confused, doesn't really know how to improve on either the skill that they're doing or what they did wrong that led to the problem or the issue that they found inside of the sport. Again, I want to emphasize this isn't to say explicit instruction is bad or shouldn't be used. It is and can be useful. It should and needs to be used in communication, especially when it comes to safety. But when looking at instruction for skill development, one study was looking at this. There were 3 groups: an explicit instruction group, so they were told exactly what to do; an implicit instruction group, not told what to do at all, just there's the activity, go do it; and then an analogy instruction group, so the educators were using metaphors to help guide the exploration of the individuals. Now, all 3 of these groups improved from the control. Comparing groups showed that the analogy learning group achieved the highest score in the retention test for both motor performance and self-efficacy. Moreover, the implicit group was better than the explicit and the control group. You can see in the figure that explicit instruction is better than nothing, but not as good as implicit instruction or the analogies. Also, as Rob mentions, when the performers were put under pressure, The serving accuracy of the group trained with explicit instructions dropped by nearly 20%, while the no instruction maintained their accuracy at the same level. In this study, the most effective method, I would argue, is the analogies, and that is the most associated with the constraints-led approach, or the ecological approach. The analogies guiding someone for self-organization rather than telling someone what to do, but the guidance still had some constraints, so it wasn't really open, finding that desirable difficulty. So when we're looking to make a change in a behavior like that forearm moving away from the body, we can use constraints. First, we want to destabilize the current attractors. Those attractor dips in the attractor landscape, we want to try and shake around, make noise, and disturb the dip so you move out and potentially go looking for another solution. The destabilizer or control parameters that you're changing might be speed, size, space, or adding some other constraints, maybe visual constraints, auditory constraints, anything to destabilize the behavior. Then once there is destabilization in this attractor behavior, we then want to encourage them to explore the landscape, explore other solutions. And then remembering back to what I was saying about errors, maybe we want to amplify different errors using constraints to help guide that exploration towards a particular attractor we think may be more effective. But not to the point where there's only one attractor, because they still need to self-organize for their own individual constraints. But then feedback of these new behaviors is pretty important to work out whether the behavior is effective or not. Most feedback given is about results and performance, knowledge of results and knowledge of performance. But instead, we could look at something referred to as transition feedback. Instead of telling you whether you achieved your goal or about the underlying processes, it tells you whether your search for a better solution is headed in the right direction. Going back to the forearm flyout, this is an example of a constrained practice using transition feedback. As we watch the throw, the connection ball, the yellow one, falls out as the ball is thrown. The direction of the ball forwards or backwards is the transition feedback. It isn't all about where the ball is thrown, how accurate the throw was, or where the ball goes. It's about the transition feedback, where the yellow ball goes. If the yellow connection ball goes forwards as they throw, then we know the forearm was closer to the body, which is what, as mentioned earlier, we want them to try and do. And so instead of telling them keep your forearm close, the ball is letting them know whether it was close or not, depending on where the ball goes, forwards or backwards. In team sports, small-sided games are often used. The changing numbers is a destabilizer and it allows for new attractor states, new stable behaviors to emerge through their exploration. But of course, if players are only doing the small-sided games, then those stable behaviors are likely going to be shown on the full size pitch in the whole game. This is where the transition from the task constraint game, the practice design you've created, needs to be in some way representative of the full game and making sure you are actually doing the full sport to some extent. This is one of the limitations I've seen when you look at typically like amateur football training on smaller pitches. They get good and stable behaviors at close quarters football, but as soon as you have a larger pitch, suddenly they're very quick to play the ball, even though they have the time, because the stable behaviors, the attractors, is to release the ball quickly. The constrained games have a purpose, but they should still represent the full sport, the full game. Now, some games, as mentioned earlier, look laughable. Holding tennis balls and hula hooping whilst trying to do the sport just seems really stupid. Well, all of these come from the idea about differential learning. The idea is that adding noise and destabilizing the stable behaviors allows the individuals to explore other solutions. Potentially new, more effective solutions than they'd found beforehand. In differential learning, the primary goal of practice is to add fluctuations in movement on top of the performer's inherent variability with the intent of increasing the strength of the signal. So less about directed constraints and more about adding variability for exposure and exploration. Rob uses a buffet example in the book. Say, if you want to change the nutrition of someone from eating cheeseburgers to something a little bit more nutritious, how would you go about doing that? Showing the person the buffet with the constraints-led approach may say, okay, you can only eat things on the left side of the buffet, which doesn't have the cheeseburgers in. So they still have lots of options, but you're constraining their exploration. Whereas the differential learning approach might say, okay, here's a buffet, but try this on that day, or seafood on this day, or salad on that day. They are designed to randomly perturb the system. It is all about exploring the movement space. We spoke about noise earlier. Adding noise can help. mainly stochastic noise. And yes, the amount of noise for each person will differ because there's different desirable difficulties in varying contexts. But with differential learning, they are exploring the varying noises for themselves, finding a desirable difficulty. Not only is this fun, which is great, especially for kids that want to participate in the activities, it's much more fun to explore movement than be told exactly what to do and standing in lines and following instructions. But when we look at this fun and this freedom, this differential learning exploration, it is important to consider that individual fluctuations in individual variability will impact what sort of constraints we may want to add or how much flexibility, variability we add to a training environment, because if they're already coming in with lots of variability, adding more may be too much, so not desirable for their learning. Again, trying to find that balance, that desirable difficulty. Research has shown that the benefits of adding random conditions to practice are significantly lower in situations with more natural variability. But an individual's willingness to explore will also impact how effective these sorts of environments would be. This is where I think about the culture and the social context of the learning environments, potentially the culture of the club, culture of the team, the people around you, and this is where concepts like psychological safety get involved in the coaching, the education environments that you're building and you're working within. Now, for those of you that are skeptical, and healthy skepticism is pretty useful, I'm showing you a table from Rob. Now, I recognize this is biased because obviously Rob and I are both ecologically inclined, so there is bias towards this table, but you can see there are lots of positives. And spoiler, most studies found differential learning and the constraints-led approach to be more effective. But what if this fun exploration differential learning helps an individual attract to a stable behavior that's ineffective in the whole sport? Well, again, it comes back to variability and optimal variability. The degrees of freedom problem is helped early on with novices by freezing movements, those robot-like movements. The freezing of movements limits what individuals can do, limits their solutions. Freezing or self-imposed constraints lead to attractors. However, as we develop our skills and gain an expertise, calibration of movements, we would want to alter, shift, change those freezes, those self-imposed constraints. We might start by freezing joint range of motion, but then as we develop skills, we start to increase that range of motion. Then we can also consider coordination freezes, so instead of being in sync, we could then make them more independent of one another, the joints more independent. And this development, this exploration of joint range of motion and coordination independently moving is where individuals can find their own optimal solutions. As mentioned throughout this video, what's effective for one may not be and probably won't be effective for another. A beach volleyball study actually tried to help novices find optimal solutions by watching experts. One group of novices were trained to adopt the gaze of experts. That was called the functional group. They looked at the attacker and tried to anticipate the point of contact. One group just followed the ball, so that was called the dysfunctional group. And then there was a control group that received just no training. Results revealed that the participants did not learn to adopt the functional control pattern, and there were no differences in performance between the groups. However, when the performers were asked to keep their eyes still, something called quiet eye, there was improvement. The quiet eye was found to be more effective. The constraint or the degrees of freedom of the gaze was more effective than giving an optimal solution. An optimal movement solution is one that optimally satisfies the current constraints imposed on an individual performer. This is covered well in Bernstein's explanation of dexterity. Dexterity is not confined within the movements of actions themselves, but is revealed in how these movements behave in their interaction with the environment, with unexpectedness and surprises. So as we are developing our expertise, we are developing motor movement synergies, our self-organized systems like the tugging of Baz and Bab to achieve a goal. Those motor synergies, those movement synergies getting tighter and stronger as we practice, as we gain expertise, as we calibrate our movements. Finding optimal variability sounding very much like desirable difficulty. Too much or too little could be ineffective, potentially dangerous when you think about the relation to injury. Now in the book, Rob discusses good and bad variability through what's called a manifold. If we look at this figure, the black line represents an uncontrolled manifold. Good variability. If you think about holding a tray with lots of drinks, maintaining 10 newtons from both hands stops the drinks from falling off the tray. Any shift along the line and the trays are going to stay there. But if there's what's called orthogonal variability or bad variability, then it's going to drop. It's going to go away from the line and you're going to get a load of drinks on the floor. When a performer shows variability in their movement solution, it is good when it keeps the performance outcome stable and successful, and bad when it does not. So if we add some labels onto that figure from the book, this might help. So effective practice isn't necessarily about reducing variability, but reducing bad variability, moving away from that uncontrolled manifold. In a basketball study, they found that they improved not by reducing all movement variability to as low as value as possible. Instead, they restructured their variability, increasing the amount of good and decreasing the amount of bad. And this could be where creativity sort of comes from. Most people in the sports world would say the Fosby, floppy and high jump was creative, a creative solution. It was first seen in the 1968 Olympics. But he didn't just watch everyone going forwards and decide, hey, you know what, I'm going to go backwards. And he wasn't alone in developing this way of moving either. Another high jumper named Debbie Brill also developed this movement solution, her coach calling it the Brill Bend. Now, Debbie and Fosby never met. They never saw each other, but they both developed the same movement solution when the sandpit was replaced with a mat. Rob quotes Debbie in the book and she said, "There was no way anybody was going to land on their back in sand or sawdust. But when I saw the foam mat for the first time, I decided to try something different." The task constraints changed, so there were other possible solutions. So creativity isn't coming up with an idea and then executing it. It arises from a symmetrical, coupled interaction between the individual, task, and environmental constraints faced by a performer. Creative solutions are not locked in the brain ideas. They emerge when a performer is acting and searching for solutions to satisfy the constraints of a task. In cognitive psychology, working memory capacity is often discussed when talking about creativity. The idea is that we have a limited capacity in our brain to hold information, so if we're trying to hold all of that information together, then the capacity limit is going to limit someone's ability to be creative. A smaller working memory capacity would make it harder for someone to be creative because you've got to hold all of this information in working memory whilst trying to find a solution. At least I think that's the idea. But one study testing this looked at kickboxing novices and they were split in their working memory capacity groups. They were tasked with coming up with creative solutions. Creative in this sense meaning original and functional, something that is rare or not often seen. And after comparing the groups, there was no significant effects of working memory load on creativity outcomes, solution search, or task success. But what is maybe more interesting is when you have a look at the numbers in the groups, the high working memory load group came up with an average of 5 solutions. Arguably the better, more likely group to come up with solutions, but the lower working memory capacity group came up with an average of 6. The high working memory capacity group had a success average of 35%, and the lower working memory capacity group had a success rate average of 43%. Now, as I mentioned, the results aren't significant, but they are leaning in the wrong direction. Arguably one of the greatest cricket batsmen of all time, Sir Don Bradman, is an example used in Rob's book for a creative sportsperson. His career batting average was 99.94 runs per innings. That's roughly 50% better than the next batsman. Now that is pretty impressive, but how? During this article, they try and explain and explore Bradman's technique. It was not consistent with the coaching manual. Bradman's stance was so unconventional. His creative solutions to this cricket batting problem were original, yes, but also functional. What is interesting about his story is that he developed his cricketing skills, his cricket batting, by hitting a golf ball on the floor. Not the sort of typical task constraint you would have seen at a cricket club back then. Maybe now you see it more. But the self-imposed constraints by the environment that he had to work with allowed for self-organization of a new, novel, creative solution. Becoming good at something does not require conforming to some ideal solution. It involves adapting to the constraints you are faced with. Again, emphasizing that learners should be given opportunities to explore. Now, while scripting out this video, I was watching the recaps of the Candidates tournament, its chess tournament, and Gotham Chess was reviewing or going over one of the games, recapping one of the games, and said that the moves were creative. A creative move in chess. Chess is a highly constrained game with lots of rules and a computer bot that often gives you the right, best answer. But the thing about the computers and the bots is that their level of expertise is different from that of humans. So when there are novelties and creative solutions, it's exploring the specific situation that player is in. So the chess player can be creative against another player. Original and functional ideas to solve problems. When you think about Magnus Carlsen, he was saying that he doesn't use the best lines of the computer because they are often memorized by other players. So he plays the third, fourth, fifth best solution, which is creative. It's a creative solution to a problem. By playing less conventional lines, he's adding variability into the practice that he is more familiar with than the opponent. And another situation just to add to that is a sort of cheating-ish scandal when it comes to chess and people starting with an opening that's completely different. It's meant to give you a disadvantage, but if you're more familiar with that system, then it's been seen, as Gotham Chess explains, that actually it's not that bad because it puts people out of their comfort zone, which is potentially a creative solution to a problem. Now, for those of you that have played football, either in the UK or any other invasion game sport, I imagine you're probably familiar with a cone or two put on the floor. When I was younger, I felt like whenever I saw the stack of cones, the coach had this mini goal of, can I put all of these cones on the floor? And as a coach, I remember going to different sessions and trying to count how many cones they had on the floor to mark out all of the areas. And I'm not saying cones are bad, sometimes the amount of cones are questionable, but when you're using cones, it doesn't necessarily add that much decision making. Of course, depending on what you're using the cones for, but thinking back to a lot of the practices I've seen and I've done myself as a player is dribbling in and out of cones, and traditional cognitive psychology approaches to educating through this method, it would make sense because you're developing those skills, developing that list of instructions of things your body needs to know, your central executive needs to know to tell the body to do. This is how you run between cones. It's similar to having the agility poles and the sticks where I'm moving in and out. Is that agility or is that you just going in and out of cones and sticks? I would argue dribbling the ball in a game or agility is different from running between those cones or sticks. Unless the opponents are all lined up in a straight line and you're running in between them all with the ball or trying to dodge them. I don't know. Is that bad practice design? Well, it depends on the purpose of the practice. If the goal is for them to go in between the cones, great. If the goal is for them to develop the ability to dribble around a player or around multiple players, I have my questions. Decision making and reacting to players is different from moving between cones. Something else you may notice is that with the cones on the floor, the participant is often looking at the floor to go between the cones, but when you see them running on a pitch, would you want them looking at the floor for the cones, or with their heads up, scanning around to see other options? Now again, you could say, well, the coach can just tell them to look up, an explicit instruction, look up, so they do. But do they know why they're doing it? Do they know what they're looking for? Or could you constrain or create an environment where they need to pass to someone? Passing to someone requires for them to look up to see where they are. So they are self-organizing a solution, dribbling whilst looking up so they can pass to whoever. Breaking the dribbling or the agility down into the fundamental movements relates to the degrees of freedom, the freezing of opportunities. But isolated, decomposed practices are often extremely boring and also potentially belittling to some of the individuals participating. Oh, you can't do the basics, you can't do the fundamentals, how are you meant to be good at the whole sport? But these isolated, decontextualized skills aren't necessarily representative of the sport. You may have someone that is good at playing football, but not good at this isolated, decomposed practice. Now, an example from my sport when it comes to the fundamentals and the whole sport is that there is this idea that you need to be able to do fundamentals. So when coaching trampoline, you need to be able to do a seat landing, a front landing, and a back landing before you can learn a somersault. But doing a front landing or a seat landing or a half twist, a full twist, a straddle jump, they're not representative of a back somersault. So if a child wants to learn the back somersault, they need to learn the fundamentals of a straddle jump first, which to me seems odd. How does jumping up and then splitting your legs and then coming back down relate to you rotating backwards? There are many other examples, and a lot of people in trampoline will say, well, safety, they need to be protected on the trampoline, they need to do all of the progressions first. But my argument with that is, well, when you look at garden trampolinists, they're on the garden, they're learning somersaults, and a lot of them can do far more than Olympic competitors or anyone training an Olympic trampoline. Yet they're still healthy, they're still safe. Do they get injured? Yes, but so do people trampolining at a club as well. I think the differences here would be the task simplification. Those on garden trampoline obviously simplify the task, whereas inside of traditional practice, there's decomposed, isolated skills that aren't representative or related to the whole skill. In task simplification, the whole movement is always completed. So using this example from trampoline, doing a backwards roll is a simplified version of a tuck back somersault, whereas a straddle jump is a decomposed, isolated skill that I don't think is representative of a back somersault. But going back to football again, there was a goalkeeper study that looked at penalty kicks. Using eye tracking technology, they found gaze behavior was different in coupled and uncoupled tasks. In the decoupled task, the goalkeeper didn't move, they just said left or right to where they thought the penalty was going to go. In the coupled task, they had to actually dive left or right. And when you look at the results, this suggests and shows that perception and action are coupled. You doing the movement, doing the whole movement is different. It's completely different from doing an isolated, decomposed version of it, i.e. standing there saying left or right, is different from actually moving, actually diving. That is emphasized in the ecological approach. Organism, environment, relationship. Context matters. When we talk about the visual system, the light goes into our eyes and then it goes back and goes into our visual cortex. Then there is the dorsal stream that goes to the top of the brain and the ventral stream that goes to the bottom. Goodell suggested one vision stream is for action and then another is for perception. Brain damage patients actually support this division. One patient, DF, actually struggled to say whether a line was vertical, horizontal, or tilted, but could post a letter through a box with no problem. This suggests that asking for an explanation, a decoupled task, is different from action, from doing something. The ventral stream as vision for perception, the dorsal stream as vision for action. We propose that the ventral stream of the projections from the striate cortex to the inferotemporal cortex plays the major role in the perceptual identification of objects, while the dorsal stream projecting from the striate cortex to the posterior parietal region mediates the required sensory-motor transformations for visually guided actions directed at such objects. We are perceiving organisms, but the type of task will affect our perceptions for action, for a verbal explanation or a movement behavior. And those movement behaviors have variability. So even with the smallest of changes, there are huge differences. Take this interaction between a world-class batter and a world-class pitcher from two different sports, baseball and softball. Softball has a bigger ball, they are closer when throwing, and they throw underhand instead of overhand. As you're watching through this, you can see that there is no contact. Not one contact by the batter. The world-class baseball batter did no better than I could do at swinging a bat against this pitcher. Being skillful is a highly specific relationship to context. Fundamentals are often taught in isolated, decomposed practices. Again, that's not a bad thing because it is constraining individuals' movements to help them develop, potentially through task simplification. But if skill is highly specific to the context, they need to really be playing the game. So a question, can you learn the fundamentals through just playing the game? Representative practice of the whole activity, but maybe simplified. Football being the world's most popular sport, again, there are loads of studies, so we'll have to go back to football really for this. Rob does talk about baseball in the book, so if you're interested to hear some baseball examples, you can grab the book, again, link in the description below. But one football study got 10 and 11-year-olds to practice dribbling, passing, and decision-making over a 22-week program. The results showed significant differences in favour of the experimental group in decision-making and the execution of passes after the intervention. However, such differences were not found for dribbling. So no isolated drills, no focus on a best technique or teaching the fundamentals first. It was just the game, and they managed to develop the fundamentals. Now, I do recognize that everyone is going to have a different meaning to the word fundamentals, because I think meanings are in people, not words, so the meaning of fundamentals is going to depend on your context and the organism-environment relationship. But I think most of the applications of fundamentals are the basic building blocks of more difficult skills. And this assumption falls victim to linear causality, line A to B to C to D, not A, B, C, and D all holding up a behavior. During my master's degree, I saw loads of different pyramids of fundamental movement skills and functional movement skills that lead upwards. And in this view, it often leads to conversations about early specialization or diversification, which, as I mentioned, will be a future topic. Specialization is a must to be skillful, but this is not the case. Rob introduced me to this term into the book, but I was familiar with the concept. Donor sport activities are ones which share some of the athletic movements and affordances required for successful performance in the athlete's primary target sport. During my degree, we spoke about these as assistance or alternative sports or activities, and then having a primary sport at a young age again refers to that early specialization. Do you have a primary sport, or do you just develop and engage in multiple activities? And this also brings into context about performance or participation activities, and again, topic for another video, but this does introduce ideas about talent identification in a sport. But for me, when I was younger, I played loads of sports. I played football, I played handball, I did trampoline, I also engaged in athletics, in swimming, I was in scouts, so outdoor activities like kayaking, canoeing, sailing, climbing, rock climbing, abseiling. Like, if there's an activity, I've probably done it a couple of times at least. And then when you go into the schooling environment, if it's cricket season, I'm playing cricket or netball or basketball or baseball or whatever the school team needed. I was sort of one of those people that just did the thing. And it's not because I'm talented at sport, it's I had developed various movement capabilities and skills because I did so many different sports. I actually remember a comment when I was younger playing football. I was running, chasing someone, and they pushed me over with their hand. Obviously, you're not supposed to do that, but it was youth football. I think it was 11 or 12 at the time, and I did a forwards roll because gymnastics, it just felt natural, so I did a forward roll and carried on running, and a parent at the end of the game said, "How did you do that? How did you know or learn to do that?" I was like, I don't know, I just did it. And thinking back, because I had done other sports, gymnastics, it was obvious to me, but if someone didn't have that expertise through movement exploration, maybe they wouldn't have found that solution. And there is one point I want to emphasize from the book that relates to findings from a study. There was no significant relationship between the number of years of sport-specific training and proprioceptive acuity, suggesting that we don't develop sensitivity to this type of information from traditional sports training. Rob going on to say, the best way to develop it would be to encourage young athletes to participate in donor sports, focusing on form and body positioning. The constraints-led approach, differential learning, repetition without repetition, seeming to encourage diversification at the youth level of exploring movement capabilities and opportunities. Bringing us to the idea of acquiring expertise. Now, this could sound picky, and those that take an ecological approach are accused of being very picky and finicky with words, but the word acquire, it suggests that we're acquiring something for storage in the brain. Those motor programs that our CEO, central executive, needs, the instructions, we need to acquire them to store them. And this acquisition of expertise is also related to this idea that we are automatic with our movements. We automatically do things without thinking. John Wooden, the famous basketball coach that I mentioned earlier, was quoted as saying, "The importance of repetition until automaticity cannot be overstated," essentially suggesting as you acquire expertise, you become more autonomous with your movements. And most of the arguments I've seen from my experience in literature and through talking with other coaches is that sport is too fast. You don't have enough time to think. You need to be autonomous in the way that you move. And this is one of the arguments for drilling, doing militaristic style drilling of the same thing over and over and over again until it becomes autonomous. Very similar to the ideas of rote repetition, something I did a lot in school, do the same problem over and over until it becomes autonomous and you can do it without thinking. But if we look at this video from Ronaldo, arguably one of the best players in the world to play the sport, football, he was paired up with a regular person playing football called Ronald, and what they had to do was score when the ball was crossed in, but in the dark. Where this is interesting is when we listen to the explanation of how Ronaldo actually moved. Human reaction time is about 200 milliseconds, and by 500 milliseconds, Ronaldo's subconscious has interpreted Andy's body language, worked out which direction the ball will go in, calculated its speed and trajectory, and then programmed his body to reach it at the optimum moment. It's almost as if they are doing math in their head, even though they wouldn't be able to describe it to you. You can see from their performance that Ronaldo saw the first part of the ball flight information he picked up from Andy kicking the ball, and was able to move his body into the correct position. This is because he has processed the information, he has experience of where the ball is likely to go, he's able to analyze all that as it's coming towards him, and therefore connect successfully with the ball. In that explanation, you can probably hear two main components. The internal representation for the central executive to do calculations and predictions of where, when, and how to move. Then, after that command is figured out, it's sent down to the body for execution, very similar to the cognitive psychology traditional explanations of how we move. This is that indirect perception that I mentioned earlier, but as we've discussed, the ecological approach rejects indirect perception and accepts direct perception instead. No central executive, no mental representations. Direct perception being central to the ideas surrounding direct learning. Learning is about attending to things, rather than acquiring the knowledge that absolves us of the need to do so. Suggesting we're not acquiring anything, we're detecting information. But then, how do we develop expertise if we're not acquiring things? Expertise is all about building a stronger, more effective connection with our environment, the organism-environment relationship. As discussed in the previous video about ideas from ecological psychology, the focus is about education of attention, encouraging the learners to focus their attention on more effective information, but also develop education of intention. Encourage learners to educate their intention for which behaviours to perform, affordances to perceive, and how to uncover possible information. Both of these being done while calibrating through learning experiences, working out how to use the information about given affordances to appropriately perceive and or perform. One popular model in skill acquisition research is the Fitz and Posner model, going through stages of learning. I learned about this model at school, then at sixth form doing my BTEC sport, then it was covered again at university, but it was challenged at university. The model maps learning from the cognitive stage to the associative stage to the autonomous stage, that autonomous motor movement, doing it without thinking. And this model was often paired up with low or high working memory demands, or low or high amounts of experience or practice. But these models, this framework is all linear. There's A to B to C to D. Learning isn't linear. We all know learning isn't linear. Non-linear pedagogy, the ecological approach, repetition without repetition, and loads of other theories and models and frameworks disagree with this linear idea of learning. Skillful behaviour is not rote, repetitive, and automatic. It is adaptive, responsive, and intelligent. When guiding individuals, it would be about developing movement skills, movement opportunities, movement adaptability, not habits or rote habits. Skill involves innovation, whereas habits involve sheer repetition. As I've tried to emphasize, variability is inevitable. Variability is everywhere, so sport-specific movements and movements in general are highly dynamic, highly variable. Now, Rob does mention in the book that using skills and habits is kind of loaded because there are different meanings, because meanings are in people, not words, so habits may mean something different to you than it does to Rob and myself. But the idea here is to emphasize developing expertise through varied skills, rather than acquiring this rote, repetitive best technique or habit that we can just do over and over again because it's been executed by the instructions and commands in our brains through calculations and predictions. When we think about technology, there is a lot of that nowadays. There are lots of different ways we could use that in different learning environments. Artificial intelligence, virtual reality, and maybe other constraining tools, maybe something replicating visual impairments. As someone that went half-blind in 2020, I was born half-deaf, but I'm half-blind as well. I'm interested in visual impairments, training with visual impairments for someone that is fully sighted to see if it helps them, but also how does that change the way that I perceive and act in the world, and how my movements also adapt to this new individual constraint. When going back to trampoline, I'm having to relearn the same skills. Even though it feels the same, it looks different. So I'm relearning the skills or adapting my skills to the new constraints that I have. When looking for studies on this, there are occlusion glasses or occlusion goggles used in football studies. In one group were using the chin-up goggles, so they were blocking vision, occluding vision down below, so they were chin-up goggles. And then another group in the study was a control group just practicing normally. But the task in their study was a dual task, so they had to receive the ball whilst reading out numbers in front of them to keep their chin up. So they're looking around, trying to replicate looking for options on a field of play when you're playing football. The group that trained with the chin-up goggles had a significant decrease in passing errors and in number call-out errors, while there were no significant changes for the control group. So the constraint for using technology, the ocular occlusion glasses, actually helped performance. There are lots of other variations of using technology as a constraint, one of them being crystal goggles that you can click and essentially it blurs the vision so you can't see, and the crystals are controllable. A different football study used these goggles and found pre-test, post-test comparisons revealed that the players who had received the goggle training improved their shooting percentages significantly, while two control groups did not. If we look at the biomechanical analysis of movements, technology has improved a lot, especially when you consider the lights that Bernstein was using. We now have motion tracking and loads of cameras to do lots of really cool things. But how we use that information, how we use that data, is interesting from the educator's and learner's perspective. One baseball study looked at the biomechanical flaws of the pitcher, and the pitcher was told all of those flaws. Data from the second evaluation revealed that 44% of all flaws had been corrected. However, as Rob says, the relatively low success rate here is not surprising, given our new view of skill acquisition, as it is not really considering the individual differences in coordination. So although all of the data looks great, it might not actually be that useful. When it comes to virtual reality, Rob did a study comparing 3 different groups: explicit instruction, self-discovery, and implicit, similar to the previous study I mentioned. As you might expect, in the first game, explicit instruction saw improvement. They just followed the instructions and they improved. However, by the second game in this study, the self-discovery group was level with the explicit instruction. The implicit group were improving, but not quite as well. Now, this seems to show that information helps learning. What a surprise. But as Rob admits, then I did something nasty. I brought in a new simulated picture with completely different tendencies. So in this virtual reality environment, the explicit instruction group were following just this picture, this AI picture that it was doing the same thing, but Rob changed that picture, but didn't tell the participants. Yes, it is kind of nasty, but is also representative of the whole sport. You don't actually know what the person is going to do. Some of you might be able to guess what happened, but the explicit instruction group dropped in performance. However, the self-discovery group didn't, and neither did the implicit group. They saw no effect from the change. So there seems to be a trade-off in time with how individuals learn. Explicit instruction may be better for short-term learning, but as something goes long-term or more dynamic in changing environments, self-discovery and implicit may be more beneficial. But then something else I found that was quite interesting that was mentioned in the book was about ironic errors. Ironic errors involve doing specifically what we intend not to do. If I say, don't think of a pink elephant, you think of a pink elephant. Ironic process theory suggests that if you tell someone not to do something, they're actually more likely to do the thing you tell them not to do. And then when Rob was testing this in sports performance, the ironic group, the number of pitches thrown in the ironic zone, was significantly higher under pressure, and there were no significant changes in kinematics. Now, broadly speaking, bringing this all together, we could say, oh, well, it just depends. The data has both pros and cons, but That's pretty obvious. However, for those in high performance and potentially even low performance, the data can get in the way. And those in participation sport, maybe the data is actually insignificant. I personally agree with what Rob says here. There needs to be a coach between the data and the athlete. Now, earlier I mentioned variability in relation to injury. Well, ACL knee injuries are pretty common in football and in other sports, but there's been lots of research, as you can imagine, in ACL injuries inside of football. One study was looking at 3 groups, looking specifically at non-contact ACL injuries, so the player that gets injured isn't in contact with another player. And obviously for ethical and safety reasons, there wasn't actually injuries going on here, but they were looking at the kinematics and kinetics and the biomechanics of the movements of red flags of likely ACL injuries. The 3 groups were linear pedagogy, non-linear pedagogy, and differential learning. Differential learning being very similar to constraints-led approach, but they are different, both of which follow the ideas from the ecological approach or ecological psychology. Our findings indicate that beginner male soccer players may benefit from training programs incorporating NLP, non-linear pedagogy, or DL, differential learning, versus LP, linear pedagogy, to lower biomechanical factors associated with non-contact ACL injury, most likely because of the associated increased execution variability during training, supporting what I suggested earlier about more variability in training helping to prevent injury. Maybe using donor sports or other activities to help add variability to individual practice, which again moves towards early diversification rather than early specialization when it comes to training and youth development. I've personally spoken with a couple of high-level rugby coaches and heard experiences of other rugby coaches using ballet as an alternative or as a donor sport to help with movement capabilities and preventing injury. So ballet with rugby. I've seen handball players using football or soccer as a donor or variation of sport to vary the practice. And of course there are various other crossovers, some of which actually lead to sport changes. You can see professional athletes moving from one sport to another sport because there are transferable skills, but they are still slightly different. One of the more obscure but obvious when you think about it transfers between sports is a sprinter going to bobsleigh, or bobsleigh going to sprinting, but normally it's the other way around, because sprinting at the start line of a bobsleigh, you need lots of power to sprint and move forwards. Very similar, but still slightly different. But coming back to the injuries, most injuries happen in unplanned situations or unplanned movements, a sudden, unexpected change. So if most movements are planned in highly constrained environments and practice design, maybe something that is heavily drilled and it mimics more of a rote repetition rather than repetition without repetition, then when the individual plays the whole sport and variability is added, they may not be as adaptable to those sudden changes, which could increase the likelihood of injury. A volleyball study actually looked at each of these injury points. Force plate data revealed that the power and energy absorption in the knee was significantly higher in the planned condition as compared to unplanned condition. So planned movements have the potential for more higher forces absorbed. Motion capture data revealed that there were greater peak knee flexion and internal rotation for the planned movements. So planned movements has higher potential for more rotation and flexion at joints. For knee and hip measures, there was evidence of greater variability in the unplanned conditions. So the unplanned conditions has higher potential for less similar movements. So those 3 signifiers of things you would want to see in practice to help avoid injury actually suggests that unplanned movements are more effective than planned movements inside of your practice design. Similar results have been found when coupling perception and action. The coupled group had significant reductions in peak moments of force and muscle activation. When it comes to bad technique, there is a clear relationship between bad technique and likelihood of injury. But I think anyone could work that out. But from what I've seen and from what I've read inside of the book, injury is more about just an ineffective movement pattern. There are more deviations to consider when we look at injury as a whole. Deviation from a best technique isn't necessarily the best or most effective signifier to look at to try and prevent injury. And of course, when we're talking about bad technique, we will all have a different meaning of what bad technique looks like in movements. So just like in most science, it depends. But something else that Rob discusses, which we actually spoke about quite a lot during my master's degree in strength and conditioning, is instead of rehabilitation, it's adaptation. So injury adaptation. Recovery suggests you go back to where you were, but if you're young and you're growing, well, you don't go back to where you were. You're adapting to the new environment, the new dynamics, the new internal and individual constraints that we have. And obviously with my eyesight, I can't recover from my eyesight. I've lost it. It's gone. But I can adapt to the new individual constraints. If you want to hear more about Rob's story, how he got into ecological dynamics, ecological approach, and what he does, then you can buy the book. It's in the description below where he talks about it more, or you can actually listen to his podcast, the Perception Action Podcast, which I listen to. I'm a regular listener. But for those of you interested in ecological psychology, the assumptions, the philosophy that holds up all of these sort of differential learning, constraints-led approach, I did a video on that previously, which I'll leave a link over there.